mostly the University of Washington group from the forestry school, but a number of other people got involved in a kind of major cooperative research program, and 2 or 3 ancillary grants from NSF. And the way those were set up, the guy who followed Jack Spencer, Ken Turnbull, who was our executive director, the way it was set up, he had access to all those accounts. So I don't remember the detail, but basically what he did is spent out the overhead in anticipation of getting the overhead from NSF. And so I was president at the time, so I was in the middle of this. The NSF auditor that came and looked at the books and everything said everything's okay. But when I got back to Washington, the chief said, no, we're not going to give you the overhead. So we were in the hole for like big money in those days. And the money was owed to the member institutions because they had been, it was like he had a series of credit cards, and there was, he used them. So that was pretty bad. I had to fire Ken. And then we had to run around, how are we going to come up with all this dough to pay back the institutions? So actually, I was able to negotiate with all of them, and they said, well, we won't call the chits in for a while, but we want our money. And so we put together a committee, our grant officer from USC and Steve Harwood and Don Stone, who was treasurer at that time, and we made a number of trips to Washington and negotiated with NSF, and finally it was decided to move the operation from Seattle back down to Duke. Don would take over as executive director. Duke was welcoming, and on that basis, Don wrote up a grant which included enough money to reimburse everybody. And of course, the whole sad thing about that was the amount that they gave us in that grant was the same as the overhead that Turnbull had anticipated. But anyway, but anyway, those were dark days because we were afraid we were going to have to sell the Selva to pay off the overhead stuff.
And then Don drove to Seattle, was it?
Yeah, he went to Seattle, got all the files and accounts and so forth, and brought them back to Duke. So that was probably our worst edge of the cliff.
And when in there was La Selva purchased, and how did that come about?
Well, La Selva was, Les Holdridge had bought La Selva with the idea of using part of it to experiment with multi-crops, lowland tropics, and the rest to retain as a natural forest. And after OTS was formed, I guess Les was having some of his own financial problems, so he offered to sell it to OTS. And fortunately, we were in good shape at that time financially, and we jumped at the opportunity. So that's where La Selva came from, the original La Selva.
And is it true that we had to buy it in gold bullion?
Yes, Les insisted that we had to give him gold bars. I forget how much we paid for La Selva, but we had to actually give him the gold bars. we were on the gold standard.
So we were talking about the the purchase of La Selva, and from Les Holdridge of the Tropical Science Center. Tell us a little bit about how our interactions with the Tropical Science Center and Holdridge and that chemistry.
Well, when Holdridge was in a way involved in establishing the Organization for Tropical Studies, we'd had contact, and he gave several lectures in the early pre-OTS courses. And when we originally developed those courses and applied to NSF for funding, we sent it to one of the education sections. And Les knew about it because we'd scheduled him in to have several lectures. And he attended the World Congress of Forestry in Seattle and was talking to Jim Bethel, who at that time was at NSF, and told him about this. And Bethel was the program director for innovative programs in science education. He said, this sounds like a great idea, blah, blah, blah. And he said, but the division that you guys sent it to is never going to do anything for you. So he went back to Washington and pulled the file and approved the initial funding. So you have to say that Les and Jim, we wouldn't be at OTS without them, just like without Deabadi and Rodriguez. But anyway, so we were involved with Les right from the beginning. But he established the Tropical Science Center as a consulting firm. And unfortunately, what developed was he kind of expected that OTS would turn over all our operations to Tropical Science Center, and they, of course, would get a cut of the funding and so forth and so on. And when things shifted, when Jansen and Scott took over and ran things, at about the same time, the University of Costa Rica said, we are not going to have anything to do with you guys if you go with Tropical Science Center. So that created an unfortunate schism for many, many, many years. Right. But anyway, this was Les's finca, and of course his home, their house was what's the river station. In those days, there was nothing underneath. It was just up on stilts, like many houses in the lowlands in Costa Rica. So that's part of the story with Les Holdridge. I think some years later in the 80s, OTS gave him a special award, and so he kind of, by then, he mellowed out.